Albert Camus still matters today because the world he was trying to understand has not disappeared. It has intensified. The moral and psychological pressures Camus diagnosed in the middle of the 20th century, meaninglessness, abstraction, ideological certainty, justified cruelty, are not relics of a past era. They have simply changed form. What Camus described as the absurd has become a background condition of modern life. Camus begins with a simple observation. Human beings crave meaning, coherence, and justification, yet the world offers none of these things in any reliable or permanent way. Events happen without regard for merit. Suffering is distributed arbitrarily. Good intentions fail, evil succeeds. This gap between what we want from the world and what the world provides does not close with education, progress, or technological advancement. If anything, modern life sharpens the gap by constantly reminding us of how much we cannot control. Today, this confrontation is everywhere. We live in an age saturated with information, explanation, and opinion, yet starved of meaning. We are surrounded by narratives that claim to explain everything, economic, political, psychological, but none of them can answer the most basic question, why any of this should matter. Camus' absurd is no longer a philosophical insight reserved for a few. It is an everyday experience quietly shaping how people think and feel. The modern response to this condition often oscillates between two extremes. On one side is despair, the sense that nothing truly matters, that all commitments are arbitrary, and that seriousness itself is naive. On the other side is fanaticism, the rush toward absolute certainty, ideological purity, and moral righteousness. Both responses are attempts to escape the discomfort of living without guarantees. Camus rejects both. He rejects despair because it abandons life. He rejects fanaticism because it abandons responsibility. What makes Camus still relevant is that he refuses to let the discomfort of uncertainty justify either withdrawal or extremism. Modern nihilism is often mistaken for sophistication. To declare that nothing matters can feel like intellectual maturity, a refusal to be deceived by comforting illusions. But Camus sees this posture as a form of evasion. To say that nothing matters is not to escape responsibility, it is to abandon it. Nihilism dissolves the very conditions under which ethical judgment is possible. If nothing matters, then cruelty requires no excuse, and indifference becomes indistinguishable from honesty. At the same time, Camus is equally hostile to the modern hunger for certainty. When meaning is not found, it is often manufactured. Ideologies, identities, and moral crusades rush in to fill the void. These frameworks offer belonging, clarity, and purpose. They promise to resolve ambiguity by dividing the world into friends and enemies, good and evil, righteous and corrupt. Camus understands the psychological appeal of these systems. They relieve anxiety by simplifying reality. They offer a narrative in which suffering has meaning and sacrifice is justified. But they do so at a cost. They replace moral judgment with loyalty. They transform doubt into betrayal. And they make cruelty easier by framing it as necessity. This dynamic is as visible today as it was in Camus' time. Political discourse increasingly rewards certainty over thoughtfulness. Moral outrage replaces moral reflection. Complex human problems are reduced to slogans. Once a cause is declared just, anything done in its name becomes defensible. The language may have changed, but the structure is the same. Camus still matters because he refuses this structure. He insists that meaning cannot be imposed without consequences. When certainty replaces judgment, responsibility disappears. Actions are no longer evaluated by their human cost, but by their alignment with a narrative. This is the moral danger Camus spent his life resisting. The absurd, for Camus, is not a reason to give up, it is a reason to be careful. If the world does not provide meaning, then meaning must be created through action. But because this meaning is fragile and provisional, it must be protected from absolutism. The absence of final answers does not permit anything. It forbids total solutions. This is where Camus diverges sharply from both modern cynicism and modern extremism. He refuses the comfort of thinking that nothing matters, and he refuses the comfort of thinking that everything is justified. He occupies the uncomfortable middle space where one must act without certainty and judge without guarantees. That space is precisely where modern life places us. We are constantly asked to take positions, make judgments, and act decisively in situations that are morally complex and emotionally charged. We are pressured to choose sides quickly, to signal allegiance, to demonstrate certainty. Camus's refusal to do this is not indecision, it is discipline. Camus insists that the absence of ultimate meaning increases responsibility rather than diminishing it. If there is no God to judge us, no history to absolve us, and no ideology to excuse us, then we are left with ourselves and one another. Responsibility becomes inescapable. We cannot outsource it. This is why Camus rejects moral shortcuts so fiercely. Whenever someone says this had to be done, Camus hears an attempt to escape responsibility. Necessity becomes an alibi. Violence becomes acceptable because it is framed as unavoidable. Camus insists that even under extreme conditions, choices remain. To deny this is to deny moral agency altogether. In modern life, this logic appears constantly. Economic necessity justifies exploitation. Political necessity justifies repression. Cultural necessity justifies cruelty. The language shifts, but the function remains the same: to make harm feel inevitable and therefore blameless. Camus still matters because he refuses to let inevitability erase guilt. He insists that explanation does not equal justification. One may explain why something happens without declaring it right. This distinction is increasingly lost in a culture that confuses understanding with approval. Another reason Camus remains relevant is his insistence on limits. Modern discourse often treats limits as weakness. To hesitate is to fail. To refuse is to be naive. Camus argues the opposite. Limits are what make responsibility possible. Without limits, power expands unchecked, and human beings become means rather than ends. Camus does not ground these limits in abstract principles. He grounds them in the concrete reality of suffering. Human beings bleed, grieve, and die. Any system that treats these facts as secondary to goals or ideals has already abandoned responsibility. Camus' ethics begin and end with the human being as they exist here and now. This is why Camus' thought feels so resistant to the rhythms of modern life. It refuses speed. It resists slogans. It demands reflection where outrage is rewarded. It asks for restraint where escalation is encouraged. In a culture that prizes visibility and certainty, Camus insists on lucidity and silence. Camus still matters because he understands that moral failure rarely announces itself as evil. It announces itself as necessity, urgency, or righteousness. People rarely commit cruelty because they enjoy it. They commit it because they believe it is required. Camus' work is an extended attempt to dismantle that belief. He does not do this by offering alternative certainties. He does it by insisting that uncertainty must be lived honestly. The discomfort of not knowing does not excuse us from acting responsibly. It makes responsibility more demanding. This is the heart of Camus's relevance today. We live in a world where meaning is unstable, certainty is seductive, and responsibility is constantly being displaced onto systems, structures, and narratives. Camus refuses this displacement. He insists that responsibility cannot be delegated. What remains is not despair, but revolt. Not violent revolt, but moral revolt. The refusal to let injustice become normal. The refusal to let cruelty become reasonable. The refusal to let abstraction erase the human cost of action. Camus still matters because he teaches us how to live without lies. Not comforting lies, not ideological lies, not nihilistic lies. To live without lies is exhausting. It offers no rest, but it preserves something essential, the ability to judge, to refuse, and to remain human in a world that constantly pressures us to become something else. That is the problem Camus diagnosed. What remains is how to respond. If the first reason Camus still matters today is that he diagnosed our condition with unsettling accuracy, the second is that he refused the most tempting responses to it. Camus did not offer comfort, and he did not offer escape. What he offered was a way of living that remains possible, even when certainty, redemption, and final solutions are unavailable. In a world increasingly dominated by moral shortcuts, this refusal is his enduring contribution. Camus' answer to the absurd is not resignation, and it is not hope. It is revolt. But revolt, for Camus, does not mean permanent outrage or endless escalation. It means a sustained refusal to accept certain things as normal. Revolt is not an explosion, it is a stance. It is the decision to draw a line and to defend it without pretending that the line is guaranteed by anything beyond human judgment. This matters today because modern life constantly encourages us to abandon judgment in exchange for belonging. Political movements, cultural identities, and moral tribes offer clarity and protection. They tell us what to think, who to blame, and which actions are justified. In return, they demand loyalty. Doubt is treated as weakness. Hesitation is treated as betrayal. Responsibility is absorbed into collective certainty. Camus refuses this exchange. He insists that responsibility cannot be outsourced to a group, a cause, or a narrative. Even when one belongs, one remains responsible. Even when one agrees, one must still judge. Even when one is on the right side, one does not become morally exempt. This insistence is deeply unfashionable. Modern discourse rewards certainty, speed, and moral performance. It punishes restraint, silence, and ambiguity. Camus offers none of the things that travel well in such an environment. He offers limits, he offers doubt, he offers refusal. Camus still matters because he reminds us that not everything that can be done should be done, and not everything that is effective is therefore justified. In a technological and political landscape where capability expands faster than wisdom, this reminder is urgent. Power without limits does not remain neutral. It seeks justification, and justification, once found, rarely restrains itself. One of Camus' most important contributions is his refusal to justify violence by appeal to future goods. Modern politics often argues that suffering now will be redeemed later. Environmental destruction is justified by economic growth. Civilian deaths are justified by security. Repression is justified by stability. In each case, harm is presented as necessary for a greater good. Camus rejects this logic at its root. A future that does not yet exist cannot answer for the suffering demanded in its name. Once we allow imagined outcomes to justify present cruelty, responsibility evaporates. The victims disappear into abstraction. The moral cost becomes invisible. This is why Camus insists on limits even in situations of genuine injustice. He does not deny that injustice provokes anger or demands action. He denies that anger grants moral permission. Revolt, for Camus, must remain faithful to its origin. It begins as a defense of human dignity. The moment it abandons that dignity, it betrays itself. This insight is especially relevant in an age of permanent crisis. Crises compress time. They demand immediate action. They reward decisiveness over reflection. Under these conditions, moral limits are often dismissed as luxuries. Camus insists that they are necessities. Without limits, crisis becomes an excuse for anything. Camus' resistance to moral absolutism is not indifference, it is discipline. He understands that the temptation to do harm often presents itself as moral urgency. The more convinced we are of our righteousness, the less likely we are to examine the cost of our actions. Camus's refusal to sanctify necessity is a refusal to let urgency replace judgment. This is also why Camus places such emphasis on intellectual responsibility. Intellectuals rarely wield direct power, but they shape the moral climate in which power operates. They provide the language that turns cruelty into policy and violence into necessity. Camus insists that explanation must never become excuse. Understanding why something happens does not make it right. In contemporary life, this confusion is constant. Social, economic, and psychological explanations are offered for nearly everything. While understanding is valuable, it becomes dangerous when it dissolves accountability. Camus insists that one can understand without absolving. Responsibility survives explanation. Camus' relevance today is also tied to his rejection of total solutions. Modern politics is saturated with proposals that promise to solve everything at once. These proposals are seductive precisely because they offer escape from complexity. But total solutions demand total power, and total power inevitably erases limits. Camus does not believe the world can be fixed. He believes it can be resisted. Resistance, for Camus, is not a path to paradise. It is a way of preventing hell from becoming normal. This modesty is not weakness. It is realism. This realism is inseparable from Camus' insistence on human scale. He distrusts abstractions that grow so large they no longer correspond to lived experience. Systems, models, and ideologies tend to operate at scales that obscure individual suffering. Camus continually brings attention back to the human being in front of us, the person who bleeds, fears, and dies. This focus on the concrete is why Camus' ethics feel so demanding. They offer no cover. One cannot hide behind trends, laws, or inevitabilities. One must answer for what one supports, excuses, or ignores. Responsibility becomes personal again. Camus' position is especially challenging in a culture that encourages moral exhibition. Outrage is performed publicly. Allegiance is signaled constantly. Camus offers no performative ethics. Responsibility for him is often silent. It may involve refusing to join in. It may involve declining to speak when speech would simplify rather than clarify. This silence is not passivity. It is restraint. Camus understands that some harms are caused not by action, but by reckless speech, by slogans that inflame, by narratives that divide the world too cleanly. Responsibility sometimes requires saying less, not more. Camus still matters because he refuses to equate moral seriousness with aggression. He refuses the idea that one must always escalate. He insists that sometimes the most responsible act is refusal, refusal to lie, refusal to excuse, refusal to participate. This refusal becomes particularly clear in Camus' response to political violence. He opposes both oppression and terrorism. He refuses the logic that forces a choice between injustice and murder. He insists that one can reject both, even if doing so leaves one isolated. This isolation is not incidental. Camus understands that moral responsibility often leads to solitude. Those who refuse shortcuts cannot easily belong to movements that rely on them. Camus accepts this cost. He does not romanticize it, but he does not evade it. Despite this severity, Camus is not hostile to solidarity. On the contrary, his ethics are grounded in it. Because there is no higher meaning, human beings become each other's only measure. Because there is no guaranteed justice, we become responsible for limiting injustice ourselves. This solidarity is fragile. It cannot be enforced. It must be chosen again and again. Camus' revolt is therefore not a single act, but a practice. One resists today, knowing that resistance will be required again tomorrow. Camus offers no final reassurance. He does not promise that responsibility will be rewarded or that restraint will succeed. He insists only that abandoning responsibility guarantees moral failure even when it brings victory. This is why Camus still matters today. In a world that constantly pressures us to trade judgment for certainty, restraint for effectiveness, and conscience for belonging, Camus insists on something harder: living without appeal. To live without appeal is to accept that no authority will absolve us. It is to act knowing that our actions may fail and that no future will redeem them. It is to judge even when judgment is uncomfortable. It is to refuse even when refusal isolates us. Camus does not save the world. He refuses to let us destroy it in the name of saving it. That refusal, quiet, disciplined and relentless, is why he still matters.